Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. David Anthony McGreevy was born in 1951 in the coastal town of Southport, England. He was the second eldest of 6 children, part of a large, bustling household raised by Thomas and Bella McGreevy. His father, Thomas, served as a sergeant in the British Army, while his mother, Bella, stayed at home caring for the children. Because of his father's role in the military, the family didn't stay in one place for long. They moved around constantly, not just within the UK, but overseas as well. At one point, they were even stationed in Germany. And for young David and his siblings, this kind of lifestyle shaped everything. They never stayed long enough to really settle. Sure, they'd make a few friends in each place, but those friendships never had the time to grow into anything lasting. Before they knew it, it was time to pack up and move again. So in the end, they really only had each other. But that doesn't mean David had a miserable childhood. In fact, by all accounts, it was a fairly normal one. A bit rootless, maybe, but still filled with the kind of everyday joys you'd expect in a big family. He was described as a happy child, energetic, adventurous. He and his siblings would go on bike rides, take family picnics, and even try out skiing depending on where they were living at the time. They were close. They had each other. And that stability, the kind that only family can give when the rest of life keeps shifting, was enough. There were no early warning signs, no known trauma, no obvious cracks in his early life. From the outside, David McGreevy's childhood looked normal, but that wouldn't last forever. In 1967, when David McGreevy was just 15 years old, he made a decision that he believed would shape the rest of his life. He left school and joined the Royal Navy. It wasn't a half-hearted choice. This was something he had dreamed about. Ever since he was a child, he had talked about it. This was his vision of the future. The structure, the honor, the discipline, it all meant something to him. He saw it as more than just a job. For David, it was a purpose. But not everyone shared that confidence in him. His father had doubts. He didn't think David was quite ready, didn't believe he had the commitment or the discipline the Navy demanded. Still, despite the skepticism, David signed up and began what he hoped would be his dream career. But the reality of Navy life was something else entirely. It was harsh, competitive, intense. The structure that David thought he craved turned out to be far more rigid than he imagined. The Navy wasn't just about uniforms and pride date. It was about pressure, constant ranking, constant comparison. And everyone around him was young and eager to prove themselves. It changed him, and not in the way he'd hoped. Very quickly, McGreevy's personality began to shift. He became stubborn, cocky, even arrogant. That quiet, energetic boy who once rode bikes with his siblings started to fade. And like many of the other boys, because that's what they were, really, just boys, she started getting into trouble. It wasn't always serious trouble. More often than not, it was the kind of behavior you'd expect from teenage boys with too much freedom and too little oversight: drinking, fistfights, pranks, mischief. But still, the cracks were starting to show. And slowly, the dream he once held so tightly began to slip through his fingers. But then, at just 19 years old, David McGreevy found himself in trouble, real trouble. The kind that went far beyond the harmless mischief of his peers. It started like so many of his bad decisions that he was drunk. He had been assigned watch duty alone, and instead of taking it seriously, he got bored, restless. And in that state, intoxicated, reckless, began wandering. Eventually, he made his way into the officer's wardroom, essentially an office space reserved for higher-ups. He shouldn't have been there. But he pushed open the door anyway and stepped inside. And while he was there, something caught his eye. A book sitting on a desk. His name, David McGreevy, was written inside it. That was all. Just his name. But in his drunken state, he panicked. He somehow took that to mean he was being sacked, that he was about to lose his position, maybe be reassigned somewhere else. And David didn't want that. He liked his job, what little control he felt. It gave him, and the idea of it being taken away made something inside him snap. So, still drunk and thinking irrationally, he took the book, walked over to a nearby known that was already filled with paper and set it on fire. And he didn't run. He stood there. He waited. He watched the flames grow until they were completely out of control, until the damage was done. Only then did he raise the alarm. He claimed he had no idea how the fire started, that he just happened to see smoke coming from the wardroom during his patrol. But the story didn't hold. The door had clearly been broken into. Nothing about it made sense. His superiors were suspicious, and they pulled him in for questioning. That's when he changed his story. Now, he said, yes, he had gone into the wardroom, but the fire was an accident. He said he was just looking around, reading things, smoking a cigarette, and he had accidentally dropped it into the bin. But again, his story didn't hold. Because if it was really just a cigarette, why lie about it in the first place? Why go through the effort of denying it happened at all? His commanders saw through it. They knew this wasn't just carelessness. It was deliberate. The fire had been set on purpose. And now David McGreevy wasn't just another young sailor misbehaving. He was someone who had deliberately tried to destroy evidence and risk the safety of the base in the process. David McGreevy was court-martialed for what he'd done. For those unfamiliar, a court-martial is essentially the military's version of a courtroom trial formal process to determine guilt and assign consequences. In the end, he wasn't found guilty of arson, but he was found guilty of negligence, a serious charge, especially considering his growing record of disciplinary issues. This wasn't his first mistake, and the Navy had seen enough. As punishment, McGreevy was given a 90-day sentence, a form of military detention. What exactly that entailed isn't entirely clear. Whether it was isolation, labor, or some form of restricted duty, no one really knows. That part of his record is vague. But what we do know is that around that same time, McGreevy was also ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. And whatever the results were, they've never been made public, not even to his family. His parents were never told what the assessment found. No formal explanation, no written report, just silence. And because of that silence, the rumors began. Some people believe that the results must have been bad, so disturbing or incriminating that the military didn't want anyone, not even his own parents, to know. Others suggest the opposite, that maybe the test came back clean and there was simply nothing to report. Then there are those who believe something even murkier, that maybe the test was never fully completed, or the results were lost, or someone just never bothered to process them properly. Whatever the truth is, we still don't know, and maybe we never will. In January of 1971, when David McGreevy was around 19 years old, a fellow Navy friend made a casual suggestion. He told David he should try writing to his sister. The sister's name was Mary. And so, David did. He began writing her letters. What started as a simple exchange quickly escalated into something far more intense. Within just a few weeks, David and Mary were writing to each other twice a week. These weren't short notes or casual updates. They were long, emotional letters. 5-6 pages each. Deeply personal, romantic, almost obsessive. By April, just 4 months into their correspondence, David and Mary met in person for the first time. And it didn't take long, barely a week later, they were at a social event together when David proposed, and Mary said yes. They had known each other in real life for only a few days. But in their minds, this wasn't rushed. It was love. Real, overwhelming, fast-burning love. They began planning a wedding. And after that point, they saw each other about once a month, limited by David's service in the Navy. But not everyone supported the relationship. David's family didn't approve. His mother in particular had a strong dislike for Mary. Mary had chronic health issue, a serious spinal condition, and she believed she might end up paralyzed one day. But David's mother didn't believe her. She saw Mary as a hypochondriac, someone who exaggerated her illnesses for sympathy. She didn't trust her, she didn't like her, and she didn't want her son to marry her. But David Arrogant and Stubborn didn't care. He was determined. He liked Mary. He was going to be with her, whether his family liked it or not. Then, in August of that same year, David McGreevy was discharged from the Navy. He was either 19 or 20 years old. The records are unclear. And even more unclear is why he was discharged. Maybe it was because of the fire he set. Maybe it was his pattern of bad behavior. Or maybe there was another incident entirely, one that never made it into the public record. Whatever the reason, he didn't offer one. He simply appeared at his parents' house one day without warning and said, "I'm out." David and Mary had planned to get married by the end of that year, sometime around Christmas. But there was a problem. Neither of them had any stable income. David had just left the Navy. He was unemployed. Mary wasn't working either. And while Mary would have been perfectly happy with a quiet, simple registry office ceremony, just signing the papers and moving on, David wanted more. He had his heart set on a big traditional church wedding. The dress, the venue, the reception, everything. But it wasn't realistic. And then, very suddenly, on New Year's Eve, 1972, Mary called off the engagement. She walked away from David completely. She never gave one specific reason. But over time, she shared a few that painted a clearer picture. She said the proposal had always felt rushed. She wasn't ready. The intensity, the pressure, it overwhelmed her. She also said the tension with David's mother, especially the way his mother refused to believe in her health issues, had taken a toll on the relationship. And eventually, even David stopped being supportive. He grew distant, dismissive, unkind. And maybe, she said, he just cared more about her than she did about him. She was relaxed about the wedding. He was desperate for it. It felt off balance. So she ended it. And after that, David's life just stalled. He stayed at home with his parents, drifting between odd job, chef, laborer, assistant, never holding on to any of them for long. He kept getting fired, either for drinking, bad attitude, or simply not showing up. He had no direction, no motivation, no plan. He didn't go out much, didn't have many friends, and worst of all, his drinking got worse. By this point, David was only 20 years old, but he was already sinking. He stopped helping out around the house, didn't contribute to rent, didn't clean, didn't cook. He just existed, and no one could seem to pull him out of it. By this point, David McGreevy's parents had had enough. He wasn't helping out, he wasn't working, he wasn't contributing. He was just there drifting, drinking, and doing nothing. So eventually, they kicked him out. And with nowhere else to go, David ended up bouncing between hostels and the streets. He had no real plan, no real direction. He was just trying to get by. That's when he reached out to an old friend from school, Clive, Ralph. Clive was married now to a woman named Elsie Shea, was 5 years younger than him. They'd been married for 5 years. In fact, Clive had married Elsie when she was just 16, after she got pregnant with their first child, Paul. 2 years later, they had their second child, Dawn Maria. And by the time David reconnected with them, Elsie was pregnant again, this time with their third. Clive and Elsie were living in a modest home in Rainbow Hill, a small area in Worcester. When David asked if he could stay with them for a while, just long enough to get back on his feet, they said yes. At the time, little Paul was 4 years old. Dawn was 2. And just a few months after David moved in, the Ralphs welcomed their third childer baby girl named Samantha. But the house was small, really small, just 2 bedrooms. And now 6 people were living in it. Clive and Elsie slept in the master bedroom, with the 2 youngest girls in their cots nearby. In the second bedroom, David shared a bed with 4-year-old Paul. It's hard to imagine how cramped that must have felt. Still, they tried to make it work. David agreed to pay £6 a week toward the rent. He'd help out when he could. On Sundays, he'd cook a roast dinner for the family. And when Clive was away for work, he was a lorry driver and often gone for weeks at a time. David would step in as a kind of stand-in parent. Not quite a father, not quite a babysitter, but somewhere in between. A third adult in the home. A third pair of hands. At least, that's what he was supposed to be. Unlike how things had been with his own parents, David McGreevy was actually holding up his end of the deal at the Ralph household. He helped out, he cooked, he took care of the kids. And according to everyone who knew him at the time, he loved those children. The neighbors noticed it too. They'd often say how gentle and patient he was with the 3 little ones. To them, David looked like a kind of second father, someone who was truly present, engaged, and kind. Elsie Ralph herself said that David absolutely adored the kids. People in the neighborhood described him as friendly, well-spoken, even a delight to have as a neighbor. It seemed like for a while, David had found his rhythm, a routine, maybe even a sense of belonging. Of course, people also knew about his darker side. When David really drank, his temper would change. He could become agitated, aggressive, and at times even violent. But the violence had never been directed at the Ralph family. Up to this point, at least, he had never laid a hand on them. And despite his flaws, most people just learned to keep their distance when he was drinking. Then, when baby Samantha turned 7 months old, Elsie made a decision that would shift things again. With the family growing, she decided to go back to work. She picked up a job as a barmaid, working evening shifts behind the counter. And that meant David's role in the household deepened. He became more than just a house guest. While Elsie worked evenings, David looked after the kids full time. He'd feed them, bathe them, get them ready for bed. He'd give Samantha her bottle, tuck Paul and Dawn in, and sit with them as they settled down for the night. And the thing is, she didn't seem to mind it. In fact, he actually seemed to enjoy it. He liked the routine, the warmth, the feeling of being needed. He felt like a father. And for someone like David who had lost all sense of purpose, maybe that feeling meant more than he ever let on. It was the night of Friday, the 13th of April, 1973. That evening, Elsie Ralph was working her usual shift at the bar. She was on close that night, which meant she'd be finishing up after everyone else had left. And like they often did on closing nights, she and Clive had a little tradition. Before heading home, they'd sit down together and have a quick drink. It was quiet, normal, just another night. After finishing their drinks, they set off back home. By that time, the 3 children were likely already in bed, and David McGreevy would have been there watching over them. Everything should have been calm, just a tired night ending like any other. But as they pulled up outside the house, something was wrong. There were police everywhere, lining the street, filling the front garden. No sign of David at the door, no quiet house waiting. Instead, they were stopped. One of the officers told them simply and coldly, "There's been a murder. We need to take you to the station." That was it. That was all they were told. Elsie broke down immediately. She began panicking, hyperventilating, unable to understand what was happening. An ambulance was already on the scene, and a doctor had to give her an injection just to calm her down. She later said she barely remembered anything after that moment. The next thing she clearly remembers was sitting at the police station, her and Clive side by side, waiting. And then came the words that would change everything. All 3 of their children had been murdered. Earlier that day, David McGreevy had gone to a pub with a friend, something he did regularly. Drinking had become part of his daily routine. That night, he and his friend had around 5 to 7 pints each. They were playing cards, playing darts. It was all typical, until it wasn't. At some point during the night, a fight broke out. McGreevy stubbed out his cigarette in his friend's half-finished beer, and things quickly escalated. They argued, shouted. Eventually, the 2 had to be separated. It was Clive who came to the pub to pick David up. His friend was drunk, causing trouble, out of control. Clive took him home to look after the kids while he went to collect Elsie from her shift. And like always, Clive and Elsie took their time at the bar, sitting for a drink before heading home. Which meant McGreevy knew he had the house to himself for about an hour. And I think that's when everything fell apart. Sometime between 10:15 and 11:15 p.m. on the night of Friday the 13th of April, 1973, something inside David McGreevy broke. He was already drunk, already angry, and already unstable. And that night, for reasons we'll probably never fully understand, he lost his temper with the Ralph children. It started with baby Samantha. She was just 7 months old, and like she did every night, she began to cry for her bottle. But David didn't respond with the care he usually showed. Instead, he shouted at her, telling her to stop, telling her to be quiet. But of course, she was a baby. Crying was all she could do. And so, in a moment of pure rage, David walked over and put his hand over her face, smothering her. That's what investigators believe ultimately caused her death suffocation. But it didn't stop there. Even after Samantha was dead, David kept going. He beat her, he fractured her skull, and this was a 7-month-old infant. It's the kind of violence that's hard to even comprehend. Then he moved on to the other children, 3-year-old Dawn and 4-year-old Paul. They were most likely asleep in different rooms at the time. We don't know exactly what order it happened in. David never said. He never gave a full, coherent account. Only fragments. Only pieces. And maybe that's all he remembered. Dawn was found with her throat cut. Paul had been strangled. And just like with baby Samantha, that wasn't enough for David. He left their rooms and went down into the basement of the Ralph's home. There, he found a pickaxe. He came back upstairs, and one by one, he returned to the children's bodies, and he mutilated them with it. Even then, he still wasn't done. And this is the part that even seasoned investigators say they'll never forget. He carried the children's bodies out into the backyard one at a time, and he impaled each of them on the metal garden fence. Just left them there, in full view, in the night. And then he fled. Where he went afterward, no one's really sure. And honestly, he might not even know. He was so drunk, so far gone, that his memory of that night remains broken. But by then, neighbors had already heard the noise. They'd heard banging, screaming, the cries of children. They'd seen lights flickering on and off in different rooms. They knew something was wrong. And so, someone picked up the phone and called the police. When police arrived at the house, they didn't know what to expect. They assumed it might have been a domestic disturbance, maybe a fight, maybe an argument that got out of hand. Something difficult, sure, but nothing that could have prepared them for what they were about to find. They went to the front door, they knocked, waited, no answer. So they made their way around the back of the house, and that's when they saw it. The bodies of the Ralph children impaled on the fence. The scene was beyond comprehension. It was something no one should ever have to witness, let alone process. The officers quickly cordoned off the area. They tried to make sense of what had just unfolded. And their minds went where anyone would in that situation. Where are the parents? Clive and Elsie were nowhere to be seen. No witnesses, no explanation, no one to speak to. At first, officers feared the worst, that maybe the parents had harmed the children and then taken their own lives inside the house, or that they had run away, leaving horror behind. So the police broke into the home, slowly and carefully. But there was no one inside, just silence and blood, too much blood. Like I mentioned earlier, Clive and Elsie Ralph had parked their car just a short walk from the house. As they made their way back, everything about them seemed normal. They were smiling, talking quietly to each other, maybe tired from the day, maybe just looking forward to seeing the kids asleep in bed. They didn't look like two people who had just brutally murdered their own children, because of course they hadn't. But the police didn't know that yet. So when they approached, the officers didn't give them any details. They didn't say what had happened. They didn't mention the children. They simply said, "There's been a murder. We need to take you to the station." And that was all. Elsie was still under the effects of the sedative given to calm her at the scene. So when they arrived at the station, police let them speak first. They listened, they let them give their alibis. And it became clear very quickly that neither of them could have done this. Elsie had been working at the bar all evening. Clive had been with her, stopping in for a drink. They had witnesses, they had time-stamped accounts, so police ruled them out completely. And then they were left with the question that had been waiting all along. If not the parents, then who? There's something else, something deeply painful. Clive and Elsie were never allowed to see their children again. Not at the scene, not at the morgue, not at all. The police knew how horrific the crime had been. And like in other extreme cases, they decided that the trauma would be too great that no parent should ever have to see what had been done. So the last time Clive and Elsie ever saw their children was that quiet moment before they left for work. When they trusted someone else to watch over them, they didn't know that would be the final goodbye. As police continued questioning Clive and Elsie, the picture quickly became clear. There was only one other person who had access to the house that night. Only one person left unaccounted for, David McGreevy. So they began searching for him. But no one knew where he had gone. He had simply vanished into the night. It took time, but eventually around 4 a.m., in the early hours of the morning, officers found him. Surprisingly close to the Ralph's home. It seemed like he had wandered off, maybe sobered slightly, and then slowly made his way back toward the area, and even then, he was still very drunk. When police approached him on the street and placed him under arrest, he didn't resist. Instead, he looked confused and said, "What's all this about?" Trying to play innocent, as if he had no idea what had happened, as if nothing had gone wrong at all. But the police weren't fooled. They brought him in for interrogation, and it went on for hours. At first, he denied everything. He held his line into the next day, saying nothing of value, just denials, fog, silence, until finally, something broke. He said, "It was me, but it wasn't me." And that line, it says a lot. Maybe he was trying to say he did it, but he wasn't in control. Maybe he was trying to separate himself from the person he became that night, whether it was alcohol, the rage, or something even darker. He tried to suggest that whatever happened, he didn't feel present for it. And then he began to tell the police what he'd done to the children. During his interrogation, David McGreevy finally began to talk, and the words he used were chilling in their simplicity. He said, "I put my hand over Samantha's mouth, and it went from there." Then he added, "It's all in the house. On Paul, I used a wire. I was going to bury him, but I couldn't. I went outside and put them on the fence. All I could hear was kids, kids, and kids. That was it. There was no clear explanation, no motive, no real attempt to justify what he'd done." He said that Samantha's crying is what kicked it off, but that's something she did every night babies cry for their bottle. And up until that point, David had always handled it. He would feed her, calm her, hold her. Everyone believed he loved those children, the neighbors, Clive and Elsie. Even Elsie herself would later say that David seemed like a second father to them. So what changed? Yes, he had been drinking, but he always drank. Yes, he had a temper, but he had never hurt the children before. This wasn't a single moment of violence. It wasn't a drunken outburst. This was prolonged, deliberate, sustained. 3 children were murdered. And even after they were gone, he continued. He mutilated them, displayed them, left them on the garden fence like some kind of message that no one could understand. And that's what's haunted people about this case for decades. How does someone go from a calm, trusted caregiver to a triple child murderer in the span of a single night? Psychologists have tried to make sense of it. So has Elsie Ralph. She struggled with it for a very long time. She had seen how good David was with the children, how gentle, how involved. It just didn't make sense. Not then, not now. Some psychiatrists have speculated about possible sexual motives, suggesting that perhaps David refused to give a motive because it was too dark to say out loud. But there has never been any evidence to support that theory. No signs of sexual assault, either that night or in the weeks prior. Nothing in his behavior. No warning signs. It remains unlikely. Not impossible, but unlikely. And so the question still lingers. Why? Why that night? Why that way? No one, not police, not psychologists, not even David himself, has ever been able to give a clear answer. On the 28th of June, 1973, David McGreevy appeared in court. The proceedings didn't last long. Within just 8 minutes, he pleaded guilty. No defense, No excuses, no explanation. He didn't offer any kind of motive or justification for what he had done. He simply accepted it. And with that, David McGreevy was sentenced to 3 life terms in prison. But legally, he was given a minimum term of just 20 years. In the end, he would go on to serve 40 years. Most of those years were spent in protected conditions. Because in the prison system, those who harm children are considered the lowest of the low. They're targeted, attacked, ostracized. McGreevy was no exception. He was physically assaulted, threatened. Other inmates would sneak into his cell and urinate or defecate, smearing it on the walls and on his clothes. And so, for decades, he was hidden away. He spent much of his sentence shielded from the general prison population, not because anyone wanted to protect him, but because they knew what would happen if they didn't. In 2006, after more than 3 decades behind bars, David McGreevy was transferred to an open prison in Liverpool. An open prison still counts as a sentence. You sleep there, you're still under strict supervision, but during the day, inmates are allowed to leave the facility. They can find work, try to reintegrate, and begin transitioning back into society. Open prisons are typically reserved for inmates who authorities believe will one day be released. But McGreevy's time there didn't last long. Not long after his transfer, a newspaper found out where he was. They tracked him, learned his routine, took photos of him outside the facility. And before long, his face was on the front page of nearly every major paper. Because of that exposure, a judge ruled that McGreevy's safety was now at serious risk. So he was moved back into a closed persona, more secure facility where he was once again kept away from the public, unable to leave. Then, in December 2018, he had another parole hearing. He'd had many over the years, but each time parole had been denied. It never really seemed like there was a chance he'd be released, until that hearing. During the proceedings, one of the officials involved stood up and said that McGreevy had changed considerably over the 45 years he'd spent in prison. And for the first time, it looked very likely that David McGreevy might be released. By December 2019, discussions around his parole were still ongoing. The biggest concern was protecting Clive and Elsie Ralph making. Sure, McGreevy could never go anywhere near them. That would be a strict condition of his release. Whether he has actually been released by now isn't clear. At the time of this writing, there were no public updates confirming if he's free or still held while details are worked out. And one of the most heavily debated parts of this case now is whether or not McGreevy should be granted anonymity. Some argue that he should be protected, that once he's out, there will likely be people looking to harm him, even kill him, that revenge might come from anywhere, and that no one can truly reintegrate while living in fear of being hunted. But others believe he made his choice, he committed that crime, and now he should live with the consequence publicly. There's no easy answer.